Good morning to everyone. We're so glad that you can make it out this morning. We have visitors, and we're glad that you're here, and we hope that you'd visit again if you get the chance. This morning, we're going to go over a story in the Bible that we haven't gone over in a long time. Typically, on our Sunday evenings, we go over through a chapter in the Old Testament, and we do one chapter every week. And we had gone through this about 5.5 years ago, the book of Esther. And so we're going to kind of go over the story of that and who she was and kind of her whole, kind of that whole background. We're going to cover a lot, and I know I'm going to try my best, but I know I'll miss details. So I'd encourage you to go home and just go through the whole book. It's only 10 chapters long, and there's just a lot to learn from it. And I think this whole situation is really encouraging to me, and I thought that there could be a lot to apply to us, and so that's kind of why I picked it. And so I'll try not to jumble up the whole story as I go, so I'd encourage you to start. We're going to start in chapter 1, and so I'd encourage you to start there. So in this first chapter, we're introduced to this king named Ahasuerus, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. He is a king that's over a big territory. So he has a lot under his control, and so he's kind of a big deal. And at this time, we're introduced to him having like this big feast, this big party, and it says it went on, and about the seventh day, he became merry in his heart, because he had, it said merry with wine, I believe. And and then at that point, he asks his wife to come in, and he was going to, I guess, kind of show her off in front of all his colleagues, or the people that are in his kingdom. And she ends up refusing. She refuses this, and it doesn't really say why, but she refused to go in before the king. And so this makes the king, he's just livid. He's angry with her. It's kind of a humiliation to him in front of all these people that he's over. I'm sure that he can just picture him at this party. Just all the people are like, oh, look at the king. His wife won't even come in. And so we're introduced to that. So I want to start in chapter 1, verse 19. And this is kind of like after all this kind of went on, we're presented in chapter 1, verse 19. It says, "If it pleases the king, let a royal decree go out from him, and let it be recorded in the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so it will not be altered, that Vashti shall go no more before the king Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she." So the guys, he's talking to some of his guys, and they're saying, let's just make a decree where somebody takes her place that is better. And we'll read in chapter 2, verse 3 through 4. Starting in chapter 2, verse 3 through 4, it says, "Let the king appoint officers to all the province of his kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan, and Sidel, into the women's quarters under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, custodian of the women, and let beauty preparations be given them. Then the young women who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This thing pleased the king, and so he did." So these people say, how about we just go out through all your kingdom and we gather all the young ladies, and they'll go through this preparation, and we'll talk about that here in a moment, that prepares them to go before the king, and he'll pick out who he wants to become his queen. And so we'll go over to chapter verse 7. I think, in verse 7, we're introduced to Mordecai and Esther. This is kind of where it becomes, we're introduced to them. In verse 7, it says, "And Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter." So this is Esther's cousin that raised her. So Esther's father's nephew raised her. So assuming that there's a pretty big age gap, whenever they died, he took her in. And so he took her in. So it's kind of introducing us to these people in this story. What happens is Esther now becomes one of the young ladies that they take, and they ship off to Shushan, to this area where she will be kept in this house for around 1 year to be preparing to be put before the king to see if that's one of them that he wants to marry. verse. Also, one thing I want to mention is that when she does go, Mordecai, being her pretty much father, he tells her, don't mention that you're a Jew. See, she was a Jew and Mordecai was a Jew in this kingdom. And he tells her, don't mention that you're a Jew. And we'll read in chapter 2, verse 10 through 12. And it says, Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. And every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn Esther's welfare that was happening to her. Each young woman's turn came to go in to King Ahasuerus after she had completed 12 months of preparation according to the regulations for the women, for thus it were the days of their preparation apportioned 6 months with oil of myrrh, 6 months with perfumes and preparations for beautifying women. So I was reading the commentator, and the commentator said this is not much different than what like makeup and fragrance would be today, but they're spending a whole year getting ready to be for. This is a big deal. They're going to take the queen's place. And so this is kind of a big deal. And I wanted to point out that Mordecai, being pretty much her father and overseer of her, he's worried about her. And so we can kind of see that he's pacing. He's just wondering about her welfare, how she's doing. And that is something I wanted to point out. And so they're getting ready. In 12 months, she will be presented before the king. And also I want to point out, we won't read this, but later on in the chapter it says that Esther found favor in everyone's sight. She was favored in the whole house that she was, the eunuch that was above her. Everyone liked Esther. And I think that's a really important part of the story. And then real quick, I'll mention this too. So when she's in the situation that she is, there's Mordecai stands at the gate a lot. He's very close, not far from her, and I'm not sure how this kingdom was laid out, but he was really close. And he ends up hearing about these two men who plan to take out the king. It says they plan to lay hands on the king. He heard about it, so he was able to get a message to Esther, and she ended up being able to somehow get a message to the king, and she said, Mordecai said this is going to happen. So they look into it. They find out this is legit. So they have these men. They go and they hang them on the gallows, and they kill them for this. And so this is kind of important, if I'm able to get to it later on in the story, that plays in part. And also, again, go read it. It's really good for one to read on his own too. But I want to go to chapter 3, and we'll read verse 2 through 4. And it says, And all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him, but Mordecai would not bow or pay homage. Then the king's servant who were within the king's gate said to Mordecai, Why do you transgress the king's command? Now it happened, when they spoke to him daily, and he would not listen to them, that they told it to Haman, to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for Mordecai had told them that he was a Jew. So we see here that he's a Jew. This Haman was just basically put in power. He's second to the king, so he's a big guy. He also has a big ego to go along with it. And whenever he sees that Mordecai is not bowing down to him, it angers him a lot. And so, but we find out that he's a Jew, and so he's standing up for what is right. An interesting fact real quick, I'll mention that God, the word God, is not mentioned at all in the book of Esther. And I thought that was really interesting. There's only 2 books in the whole Bible that you will not find God mentioned in the Bible. That is the book of Esther and the Song of Solomon. To my understanding, those are the only 2. But that doesn't mean that we don't see God working through it. And so I think that's a really interesting fact that we can see. And we can see that he's standing up for what is right because the Jews weren't to bow any man. And this is a reminder that kind of goes back to the book of Daniel, whenever the three Hebrew children wouldn't bow before the king. So just an interesting fact I want to mention. And then I want to read down chapter 3, verse 6. And it says, But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him of the people of Mordecai instead of Haman. Instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. Instead of just being mad at Mordecai, he wants to destroy all the Jews. This dude, he was really upset, and he didn't like it. So we'll read in verse 8 through 9 kind of what's going on. Starting in verse 8, it says, Then Haman said to the king Ahasuerus, There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people of all your provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all other peoples, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore, it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. If it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver unto the hands of those who do the work to bring it unto the king's treasuries. So he says, King, there's an interesting fact right here. He doesn't mention who these people are. He just says, there's people out here that won't really obey your laws. They should be punished. And we'll find out that the king will say, okay, let's destroy them. And so they put a letter together to destroy them. In verse 13, and it says, verse 13, chapter 3, verse 13, it says, the letters were sent by unto all the king's providences to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. So he gets to write this letter. The king says, okay, let's do it. So he writes up this letter. He's sending out through all the land that on this day, whoever you are, you get to go kill these Jews and you get their stuff. So we're going to annihilate, get rid of them all. And so this letter's sent out, and we find out in chapter 4 that Mordecai hears about this. He hears what's going on, and obviously he's just distressed. And I think all the Jews in the kingdom at this time were, they're all worried. There's a letter come out. It's like if we were here in the United States, if somebody sent out a letter saying, let's kill all Christians, how terrified would we be? So just to put it in perspective. But we'll find out that there's this servant who comes before and by the way, I missed this fact, but by now, she had married the king. She went in, the king had picked her, and it says that he was in love with Esther. So at this time, she had married him already. I missed that fact, so just to keep, so we know where we're at. So there's a servant who is able to send messages back between Esther and Mordecai. And so we'll find that they have this long conversation, and we'll go ahead and start in chapter 4 and verse 11. In the middle of this, in verse 11, this is Esther speaking. And it says, and the king's servants and the people of the king's providence know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king who has not been called, he has put but one law, put all to death except the one whom the king holds out the golden scepter that he may live. Yet I myself have not been called to go into the king these 30 days. So they told Mordecai Esther's words, and Mordecai told them to answer Esther, do not think in your heart that you will escape the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise from the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to this kingdom for such a time as this? This is my favorite part of the whole book of Esther, where he says, who knows, maybe you're here for this exact reason. And this is one of the reasons I pointed out that we can't see God's name explicitly mentioned. But, if you can't see God in that, then I don't know where you will see God. I think that's amazing. He said it in a question form, but he says, who knows? You're put here for a reason. So that's interesting. So what's going on is Mordecai says, you need to go before the king. And she says, you can't just go before the king. See, you couldn't go before the king without being asked unless he wanted you to. If you weren't asked and she wasn't asked, he could kill you for that. And he kind of had, I guess, if he accepted you, you wouldn't die. But this is the king. He can do whatever he wants. Who's to say that he won't kill you? He just divorced his last queen. What's to hold him back from killing his other queen? So she's obviously, and I'd say justly, a little bit afraid. But he says, fine, if you don't do it, somewhere else, somebody will help, and the Jews will make it. But he said, you won't make it. And so I think that was interesting. So I want to, we'll continue reading in chapter 8, verse 1 through 8, but what had happened in between here is she went before the king. She asked, and when he seen her, he held up his scepter. So that holding up the scepter meant that she was accepted. And he said, what do you want, my lovely queen? What can I do for you? He said, whatever you want, I'll give you up to half the kingdom, whatever you want. So and she said, if it pleases the king, come to my banquet, because she did not live necessarily close to the king from my understanding. I'm not sure how it was all laid out, but she didn't necessarily live like real close. And so she, I guess in maybe a different part of like a different house or a different building. I'm not sure how that worked, but she said, if it pleases you, I want you and your servant Haman to come eat with me at a banquet. I want you to come tomorrow night, and then I'll ask you. And he says, okay, we'll be there. So comes the night that they go to see Esther, and they eat with her, and the king says, okay, what do you want, Esther? I'll give you anything up to half the kingdom. And he said, anything you want, just tell me. And she says, if it pleases you, I would like you to come again tomorrow night, and I'll feed you again. So she asked the same thing. And so it happens that they plan on going to eat with Esther again. Now, in this time, Haman, he's going home in between this first banquet, and he's bragging to his family and his friends. He's like, I've been put in second power. He said, the queen is asking me to come eat at her house. I'm eating with the king and queen. He's just bragging up and telling all his friends and family that, look at the situation I am in. What can beat that? But in this time, as he goes back and forth through the kingdom, you will read that he sees Mordecai, and it just bugs him. He loses all that happiness about what's going on in his life as soon as he sees Mordecai, and he starts thinking, you know what? I just really hate that guy. And so he ends up building I don't know exactly how these were, but it's called a gallows. And from my understanding, and I have not done a lot of research, but just a guess on this would be something similar to around in the 1800s when they would hang a person. They'd have some type of stairs they'd go on where the floor, it's something to my understanding like that. I could be way off, so if you know what that is, I'd love to hear what that is. But he started building one, and it was specifically for Mordecai. And so he starts building one, he builds it, and he starts going to the king. This is the day where that night he was supposed to go eat with the queen again. But during the day, he's on his way to talk to the king. He's like, I just want to go ahead and kill him. So he's going to ask the king if he can go ahead and just, kill Mordecai. But on his way, the king that night wasn't able to sleep the night before. And so he starts looking through his history books. Come to find out, he realized that Mordecai is the one that told him about those men that planned to take his life. And he said, did we do anything for this man? Was this man rewarded for his act? And comes to find out, no one rewarded Mordecai for his act. So he starts thinking, what can we do to reward this guy? He saved my life. So as Haman walks in the room, the king says, Haman, if there was a man I wanted to reward, how would you reward him? If you were king, how would you reward him? And Haman, thinking to himself, he thought, who would the king rather reward than his second man in charge? He said, you should take your horse, your white horse, and lead him. And he named a bunch of elaborate things, and I won't get into details because I'll miss a bunch, but I would encourage you to read that. He named a bunch of things. He's like, this would be great. This would be awesome if it happens to me. And when it gets done, the king said, great. He said, you do all this for that man Mordecai. And I can just see, him being just so upset. In fact, you will read that when he went back to his house, he covered his face and he wept. It upset him so bad that the king was going to reward Mordecai. And so there's a lot of details. So that part where those men planned to kill him, I wanted to mention that. So this is the type of man that we can see Haman is. I wouldn't know how to describe him, but he's not a good man. So anyways, that night, they go before queen, and I just wanted to mention that because it kind of fills in some spots. They go before the queen, and the king says, my queen, what do you want me to do? What is your request? And she said, that you would save my people, me and my people. And she said, if we were if we were sold as servants or slaves, I wouldn't say anything. But she said, basically, she just started describing what's going to happen. He's like, what are you talking about? And she said, your wicked servant, Haman, has planned to kill my people, the Jews. And so she reveals who she is to the king, because up to this point, he didn't know who she was. And she mentioned him, and I can just picture Haman. His face just goes white, right? He's scared to death. The king becomes furious. In fact, he walks out, goes back to where he's at, and Haman's left in the room, and he's begging the queen. He's just begging, please, let's work out something, because he realizes he's in big trouble. The king comes back, and according to the commentator I was reading, Haman was probably just begging on his knees. It kind of explains that, and I'll let you read that. But it kind of made, the king made a suggestion that he was trying to make advances at his wife, which I don't think was probably true. But either way, the king's in power. He can say whatever he wants. And he said that, turns out, he hung Haman on the gallows that were built for Mordecai. which I think is a very interesting fact. The same ones that he built for Mordecai that he hated so much, he ended up being hung on it. So Esther was able to save everything. And I want to read, and we'll start in chapter 8, verse 1, and we'll read through verse 8. And it says, "On that day, King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. So the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai over the house of Haman. Now Esther spoke again to the king, fell down at his feet, and implored him with tears to counteract the evil of Haman the Agagite, and the scheme which he had devised against the Jews. And the king held out the golden scepter towards Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king and said, If it pleases the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the things seems right to the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to revoke the letter devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which wrote to annihilate the Jews who were in the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil which has come to my people, or how can I endure to see destruction of my countrymen? Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, Indeed, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hung him on the gallows, because he tried to lay hands on the Jews. You yourselves write a decree concerning the Jews, as you please, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For whatever is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring, no one can revoke. So he says, you know what? Here's the ring. You write a letter, you put my name on it, and you stamp it, and let it say whatever you want it to say, whenever she begged for her people. And so we read that she ends up saving the day. There's 2 more chapters after this, but I won't go over them. So she's able to save all the Jews. And why? Because she stood up for what was right. I thought that was interesting. You know, this whole story, and I hope it is able to relay into something that we can relate to, is that in the time when she was afraid to stand up to do what was right, she did it anyways. 1, because Mordecai was there to help her and encourage her to do what was right. But 2, she knew what was right, and she couldn't bear to see the wrong that was going to be done. My question this morning is, how can we be more like Esther? Are we going to stand up when things get hard? And no, we're not put in situations where we have to stand before somebody necessarily and be possibly put to death for whatever reason. But my question is, can we be more like Esther? Can we be ready for when things get hard and we go ahead and do what's right? One thing I want to point out, and this may not necessarily completely connect as well as I want it to, but it's one point is, how is our evangelism today? How is our evangelism to reaching out to other people? Sometimes I can feel like Esther, and I feel like I don't want to say nothing because I feel like I'll get myself in trouble trying to talk to this person, whether in whatever situation. I'm afraid they won't like what I have to say. They're not going to accept it, or I'll get myself in trouble. And I would encourage us to don't be afraid to stand up and say what is true, especially when you hear people who say something that is contradictory to the Word of God. I'm not saying that we should just stand up in the middle of everyone and be obnoxious about it, but when you hear someone say something that's not true, how quick are we to say, well, that's not exactly how it is? Or do we stay silent? You know, I think Esther's a great example of not staying silent when something's going wrong. You know, in Ezekiel, in fact, I'll go read Ezekiel chapter 3, and we'll go ahead and read verse 16, starting in verse 16. And it says, Now it came to pass at the end of 7 days that the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, I have made you a watchman for the house of Israel. Therefore, hear a word from my mouth, and give them warning from me. When I say to the wicked, You shall surely die, and you give no warning, nor speak to warn the wicked from his wicked way, to save his life, and to save wicked man shall... That same wicked man shall die in his iniquity, but his blood I will require at your hand. You know, something he told Ezekiel, he said, you need to go warn these people. He said, but if you don't, that's fine, they're going to perish. But he said, I want to require their blood at your hand. What was Esther told? Mordecai said, if you don't go do this, that's fine. Somebody else is going to tell him. But he said, if you don't, you and your father's house will perish. What is something we can see? God requires us to do something. When we should stand up, He requires that we do it. And I think evangelism is one of those ways. No, just because we don't tell everybody that we see in Walmart about Jesus, does that mean that we failed to evangelize? Not at all. But how the people that we're around, how often are we quick to try to tell them about the gospel? Or is it too often that we're too afraid to say anything? And why is that? Is it because we're afraid that we don't know the answers to their questions when they ask? I thought about that, and I thought, what about on Judgment Day when I tried to explain to God why I didn't evangelize? Is that a very good excuse? How will the God who holds my breath in His hands take that when I could have shared the gospel with somebody else? And I thought, I don't know if there's a good excuse for that. That is one way that I thought this could connect, but also standing up for what we believe, standing up for what we believe is right and what we know is right. Just a couple of years ago, we had, COVID, 2020. There was a big, nobody knew what to do. We had the government telling us one thing, and we were trying to figure that out. And this, I thought, was a very good parallel to what we see here, standing up for what we know is right. And that situation was pretty bad, but there's a lot of situations that get much worse. Just the other day, we heard about 70 Christians over in Africa that were beheaded just because they said they were Christians. Now, how do we know that won't be here in 30 years, where we're fearing for such a thing? So will we be in Esther and stand up and do what's right, even when that it could mean our death, our demise? So my question is, are we willing to stand up and do what's right in the hard times? In Acts chapter 5, verse 29, we're told to obey God rather than man. So whenever it comes against us, we're to obey God rather than the government. But also another thing that we have to be careful for is in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 33, we're told to be careful about our communication. For evil communication corrupts good habits. We're told to be careful. If you're around a lot of people that are not good for you to be around, that are bad examples, and you create the scenario in your head for you, but how hard will it be to stand up for what is right, to be like Esther? It'll be pretty hard. I think when you're around people, and maybe it's not as bad for you, maybe you're not as easily persuaded to do something, but for some, it's a little bit harder. How quick are you to stand up for what is true whenever you have either family or friends, people that we should be careful who we're associated with? And my last point I want to point out about Esther is that we can read, like I said, God's hand was through the whole story. We can see God's movement, even though His name wasn't necessarily mentioned. That doesn't mean God was any less in it. In fact, whenever Mordecai said, again, he said, maybe you were put here for this exact moment. I think that really encourages me, just because when I think about Esther, I think about how hard her life must have been. She was born, she was orphaned, her cousin adopted her, raised her. She had no family. She was forced to be put in a situation where she had to wait a whole year without seeing Mordecai, I would assume, and she had to go marry somebody that she probably did not want to marry. But you know what? She did it. And during that time, I don't think there was probably a time where she thought, you know what? I think this is what God's calling me to do. I think this is what God expects from me. In the end, I'll end up saving my people. She probably did not think that. She probably thought, this seems a little bit unfair. But one thing we can read is, it didn't seem that she complained about her situation too often. In fact, everyone found favor. She found favor in everyone's sight. Everyone had favor for her, because not only do I believe that she was beautiful in appearance, but the person and her attitude and her character, I believe, was that. And my point is sometimes we can feel in the same situation alone. We can feel like sometimes we don't feel real important. But that's not who God is, and I don't think God ever made us to feel that we are alone. We can read in Psalms chapter 139, verse 16, and some of the brothers, we had talked about this a couple months ago, about this very verse. And it says, in verse 16, it says, your eyes saw my substance, being yet unformed, and in your book they were written, the days fashioned for me, and when as yet they were none of them. What does it say? He said, God knew who I was before I was even created, and He said, He knows how my days will go before they've ever happened. That doesn't sound like a God to me who would leave somebody alone and that you should feel alone. We should feel that God is close. If you've obeyed the gospel and you know that you're all right, know that God is with you, and that God, not necessarily, I hear a lot of people say, God has a plan for you. And a lot of times it's because of some career. No, I don't believe God cares about your career as long as you're able to do what. I believe that He does have a plan for us, though, and that is to obey the gospel and to live a faithful life unto Him. We can read, also, and another point I want to point out is that Esther was willing to go do what was right, like we said, but we can read in Isaiah chapter 6, verse 8, the Lord said, who's going to go? Who's going to do it? And Isaiah said, I will go, send me. That's also another question I want to ask. How often are we ready to stand up and do the work of the Lord? I was thinking about the song with this lesson. I thought, being a worker for the Lord, and then Ricky led it, I want to be a worker for the Lord. When we sing that, do we really mean that? When we sing, I want to be the worker of the Lord, a brother in Mexico had said, we sing these songs, I want to be a worker for the Lord, but we really don't mean it. And I know this because Ricardo translated it, not because I'm fluent in Spanish. But one of the brethren had said that, and Ricardo had made the point, that's a real question that we should ask. We sing these songs, and we're supposed to worship God in spirit and in truth, but is it true when we sing, I want to be a worker for the Lord? Are we singing that in truth? When we whether it be helping the sick or whatever it is, you put your own scenario in your head. Are we doing that? Are we? And I fail at that more than I would like to admit. But the truth is, God is there for us, and He's with us. And if we will do right, He'll be faithful to us. And the question is, are we faithful to Him in all that we can be faithful? We can read all of this, and we can see that God has intentions for each and every one of us, and hopefully we follow that. Not all of us do. But do we have the attitude to want to do? Do we have the person, or do we want to be an Esther today? You can be an Esther today. If you've never obeyed the gospel, you can stand up against the world and say, I want to obey the gospel. I'm going to stand up and say, obey the gospel, even though I may lose friends and family. I've heard preachers tell about people who had lost family just because they had obeyed the gospel. Now, that may not be your situation, but either way, you can obey the gospel. You can be forgiven of your sins. Jesus loved us so much that He was willing to die on the cross for us, and you can take that opportunity to be forgiven so that you might be with Him someday in paradise. I want to read John chapter 15, verse 13. It says, greater love has no one than this, than to lay down his life for his friends. And then you can also read in 1 John chapter 3, verse 16, he said, this is how we know what is love. He said that He died for us, and we know it, and so we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. That is a God that sounds like He is very near and dear to us, those who are faithful. And we can also read in Revelation chapter 2, verse 10, that if we stay faithful, we will be rewarded with a crown of righteousness. Have you remained faithful? Maybe you've never obeyed the gospel. You can do that this morning and be forgiven of your sins. But maybe you've already done that and you've fallen away. Peter said, it is worse for you to have obeyed the gospel and to fallen away on Judgment Day. Please do not be that person. But either case, please come while we stand and while we sing.